Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime Biographies. Tonight we're going to travel together through a different kind of story, not of one person, but of millions. A story written in whispered fears and quiet resilience, in school hallways and kitchen tables, in the glow of television sets, and the shadow of something vast and unseen. Picture this. It's a cool autumn evening in 1962. The air smells of wood smoke and damp leaves. Somewhere in a suburban neighborhood, a father sits in his living room, the blue light of the evening news flickering across his face. His children play on the carpet, building towers with wooden blocks, unaware that halfway across the world, decisions are being made that will color every day of their growing up. The radiator hums. Outside, street lamps come on one by one, little moons against the gathering dark. Tonight, we're going to slow down and walk through those decades together. The years when the world held its breath, when generations grew up in the long shadow of two superpowers who never quite went to war, but never quite found peace either. If you enjoy these gentle journeys through history, a like or subscription helps us keep the lights on. We appreciate you being here. What does it mean to grow up when the world might end at any moment, and yet somehow, life still asks you to go to school, fall in love, dream about the future? This is the story of the Cold War, and how it shaped the hearts and habits of everyone who lived through it. The Second World War ends on a summer day in 1945, and for a moment, the whole world exhales. Cities lie in ruins, Berlin, Tokyo, London scarred and smoking. But there's relief too, profound and bone-deep. Soldiers come home. Families embrace on train platforms. Children who've known only sirens and rationing finally taste chocolate again, feel their father's arms. But even as the ticker tape falls in celebration, something else is beginning. In conference rooms in Yalta and Potsdam, men in suits draw lines on maps with the confidence of gods. Germany is divided, Europe is divided, and two nations, once allies against a common enemy, begin to eye each other across the rubble. The United States and the Soviet Union, capitalism and communism, two visions of how the world should be, and neither willing to blink first. Imagine a mother in Kansas, hanging laundry on a line that stretches between two apple trees. The sheets snap and billow in the wind, clean and white against the blue sky. She hums as she works, grateful that her husband made it home, that her sons can grow up in peace. She doesn't yet know that peace will be a complicated word for the next 40 years. Across the ocean, in a Moscow apartment, another mother boils potatoes on a small stove. Her windows look out on a street still pocked with bullet holes. She too is grateful to have survived, grateful for the victory. She believes in the promises her government makes, a better world, equality, security. She doesn't yet know how that belief will be tested. Both women want the same things, really. Safety for their children, bread on the table, a quiet life. But they live on opposite sides of something that's already forming, an invisible wall made of suspicion and ideology, of fear dressed up as strength. The historians will call it the Cold War. Cold because the bullets mostly stayed in their chambers, because the battles were fought with words and spies and proxy armies, far from Moscow and Washington. But for the people living through it, there was nothing cold about the fear. It's March 1946, and Winston Churchill stands at a podium in Fulton, Missouri, a small college town about as far from the centers of power as you can imagine. But his words travel. They crackle over radio waves into living rooms across America, across Europe. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, he says, his voice gravelly with age and conviction. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. An iron curtain. The phrase sticks. People repeat it to each other over morning coffee, trying to picture it. This barrier that's not quite physical but somehow more real than brick and mortar. It divides East from West, communist from capitalist, us from them. In the Eastern Bloc, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Soviet influence settles like fog. Governments are reshaped, newspapers controlled, borders closed. Families who lived on one side of a street suddenly find themselves in a different world from their neighbors across the way. Letters stop arriving. Phone calls go unanswered. Picture a young woman in Prague, standing at her window as dusk falls. She's a university student, used to debating philosophy in cafes that smelled of coffee and cigarettes. Used to crossing borders to visit her aunt in Vienna. Now there are checkpoints. Now there are questions about where you're going, and why, and who you know, and whether your thoughts align with the party line. She presses her forehead against the cool glass. Below, the street lamps flicker on. The city looks the same as it always did, the same cobblestones, the same beautiful buildings with their Baroque facades. But something essential has changed. She can feel it the way you feel a storm coming, a pressure in the air. In America, the fear takes a different shape. It's 1947, and President Truman announces his doctrine: the United States will support free peoples resisting subjugation. It sounds noble. It is noble, in its way. But it's also the opening move in a game that will be played on 100 different boards, in Korea and Vietnam, in Cuba and Afghanistan, in the hearts and minds of ordinary people who just want to live their lives. Children start having drills at school. Duck and cover, the cheerful films instruct, showing cartoon turtles hiding in their shells. If you see a bright flash, duck under your desk. Cover your head, as if a wooden desk could protect you from an atomic bomb. But the children do as they're told. They're good at following instructions, and maybe in the moment of crouching under those desks, some of them feel safe. Maybe their teacher's calm voices. Good job, everyone. Now back to your arithmetic. Make it seem manageable. This threat that adults speak of in hushed tones after bedtime. The world is dividing, and childhood is dividing with it. The 1950s arrive with the pastel colors of a postcard. Pink Cadillacs and turquoise kitchens, poodle skirts and crew cuts. America is prosperous. Families move to suburbs with names like Pleasant Valley and Meadowbrook. Fathers commute to office jobs. Mothers perfect their casserole recipes. On the surface, everything gleams. But underneath, there's a hum of anxiety, like a fluorescent light that never quite stops buzzing. Companies start advertising fallout shelters. You can buy them ready-made or build your own in the backyard. Concrete bunkers stocked with canned food and water, with board games and blankets, with everything you might need to wait out the aftermath of nuclear war. Families tour model shelters at county fairs, where salesmen in crisp suits explain ventilation systems and radiation shielding as if they're selling refrigerators. Imagine a father in Ohio, standing in his backyard on a Saturday morning. He's just finished digging the hole where the shelter will go. His hands are blistered, his shirt soaked with sweat. His two daughters watch from the porch, eating popsicles that drip red and purple down their wrists. He tells himself he's being practical, responsible. The world is dangerous, and a man protects his family. But there's a question he can't quite silence. What kind of world is he saving them for? What kind of life would emerge from that bunker after weeks or months underground? Into a landscape of ash and silence? His oldest daughter waves at him. He waves back, forcing a smile. She's 9 years old and obsessed with horses. She has no idea why Daddy is digging a hole big enough to bury a car in. He'll tell her it's a storm shelter. That's close enough to the truth. At night, the fears visit in dreams. People wake gasping, having dreamed of bright flashes, of walls turning to vapor, of searching for their children in streets they no longer recognize. They don't talk about these dreams at breakfast. They butter their toast and read the paper and send the kids off to school. Life goes on because it has to. Birthday parties and baseball games, first kisses and report cards. The minutiae of living, small and sweet and stubbornly persistent even when the world feels fragile as an eggshell. In the Soviet Union, the dread takes different forms. There's pride, too. Pride in having defeated fascism, in building a new society, in reaching for the stars. But there's also the knock on the door in the night, the neighbor who stops saying hello, the careful weighing of every word you speak in public. A teacher in Leningrad stands before her class of 10-year-olds, teaching them about the glories of the revolution, about Lenin and Stalin, about the inevitable triumph of the working class. She believes most of what she says. She's seen what capitalism did to her grandparents, the poverty and hunger of the old days. This new world is supposed to be better. But she also knows what happened to her uncle, who asked too many questions at a party meeting and disappeared into the gulags. She knows that some truths are dangerous to speak aloud. So she teaches what she's supposed to teach, and at night she reads forbidden poetry by candlelight, the windows curtained, the words a secret rebellion she shares with no one. Fear shapes both sides of the Iron Curtain, but it wears different faces. October 1957. A beeping sound travels from space, picked up by radio operators around the world. Beep, beep, beep. Simple, mechanical, persistent. It's the sound of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, orbiting the Earth. In the Soviet Union, people dance in the streets. We did it. We reached beyond the atmosphere, touched the edge of the cosmos. American newspapers scream the news in bold headlines, and underneath the words is a question that tastes like metal. If they can put a satellite in space, what else can they put up there? The space race begins in earnest. It's framed as peaceful competition, as the noble pursuit of knowledge and exploration. And in many ways it is. Scientists and engineers on both sides work with genuine passion, with the wonder of children watching the stars. But it's also about power. Rockets that can carry satellites can carry warheads. Every achievement in space is a demonstration of capability, a reminder, we can reach you, wherever you are. Picture a young boy in Alabama, maybe 10 years old, lying on his back in the grass on a summer night. The air smells like honeysuckle and cut grass. Above him, the stars scatter across the darkness like spilled sugar. He's looking for Sputnik, which he's read passes over North America several times a day. He wants to see it, this tiny metal moon made by human hands. He thinks about astronauts, about what it would be like to break free of gravity, to see the Earth as a blue marble floating in velvet black. He thinks about becoming a scientist, about building rockets. The future feels infinite in this moment, full of possibility. His father calls him inside. School tomorrow. Brush your teeth. But the boy lingers a moment longer, scanning the sky. And there, is that it? A point of light moving steady and purposeful among the fixed stars. His heart leaps. He runs inside to tell his parents, words tumbling over each other. His father nods, proud and worried at once. That's something, isn't it? He says. The Russians beat us up there. The boy doesn't understand the weight in his father's voice. To him, it's just amazing that humans can do this, can fling machines into the heavens. The politics are background noise, but the politics are everything. President Kennedy, young and vigorous, stands before Congress and makes a promise. America will put a man on the moon before the decade ends. Not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. The translation: we will not be second. And so begins one of humanity's greatest endeavors, born from competition, from fear, from pride, from the very best and most complicated parts of human nature all tangled together. In the Soviet Union, a young woman named Valentina Tereshkova trains to become the first woman in space. She's a textile worker, a parachutist, someone who came from humble beginnings and now reaches for the stars. When she orbits the Earth in 1963, she looks down at the planet turning below her. No borders visible from up there, no walls, just clouds and oceans, and the thin blue line of atmosphere holding everything precious. I see the Earth, she radios down. It is so beautiful. For a moment, maybe, the Cold War seems small. Seen from space, the whole human drama is just a thin film of life on a tiny world, fragile and rare, and worth protecting. But back on the ground, the divisions remain. It's autumn 1962, and the leaves are turning red and gold across America. In Washington, D.C., President Kennedy receives photographs taken by U-2 spy planes flying over Cuba. The images show something that makes his blood run cold. Soviet missile sites under construction. Missiles that could reach Washington, New York, Chicago in minutes. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Historians will later call it the closest humanity has ever come to nuclear war. But for the 13 days it lasts, most people don't know how close the edge really is. Imagine a high school girl in Pennsylvania, sitting in her homeroom class. It's mid-morning, and she's only half listening to the principal's voice crackling over the intercom. Something about tensions with Cuba, something about civil defense. She's more worried about the history test next period, about whether Danny Martinez noticed her new sweater. But when she gets home, her mother is crying at the kitchen table, radio on, and her father's face has gone gray. The news is talking about quarantines and showdowns at sea. That night, her parents talk in low voices after she's supposed to be asleep. She creeps to the top of the stairs and listens. If it happens, her mother is saying, will we even know? Or will it just, don't, her father interrupts. Don't think like that. But everyone is thinking like that. For 13 days, the world holds its breath. Soviet ships approach the American blockade around Cuba. One miscommunication, one trigger-happy officer, one mistake, and the missiles fly. And after the missiles, what? Ash and rubble and the end of the story. In Moscow, Premier Khrushchev weighs his options. Pull back and look weak, or press forward and risk annihilation? He's a complicated man, crude and clever at once, a survivor of Stalin's purges, who knows what real fear looks like. He has grandchildren. He has a country to protect, a legacy to consider. On the Soviet submarines in the Caribbean, officers sweat in the cramped metal tubes, breathing recycled air, running low on battery power, unable to surface, unable to communicate with Moscow. They carry nuclear torpedoes. Some of them think the war has already started. The decision to fire rests with 3 men, and one of them, Vasily Arkhipov, says no, refuses to authorize the launch. History turns on these moments. The decision that doesn't get made, the order that doesn't get given. We live in the world where Arkhipov said no, where Kennedy and Khrushchev found a way to step back from the precipice. But it was close, so terrifyingly close. The crisis ends with a deal made in secret. Soviet missiles leave Cuba. American missiles leave Turkey. Both sides claim victory. Both sides learn that the game they're playing can end with everyone losing. After it's over, after the Soviet ships turn around and the world begins to breathe again, a hotline is installed, a direct communication link between Washington and Moscow, so that next time, if there is a next time, the leaders can talk to each other without waiting for telegrams and translators, can hear the human voice on the other end of the line. The girl in Pennsylvania doesn't take her history test that week. School closes for 2 days. When it reopens, nobody mentions it. They go back to declensions and quadratic equations, to pep rallies and cafeteria food. Life, insisting on itself again. But something has changed. The adults seem older somehow, tired, and the girl finds herself noticing things she never paid attention to before. How her mother lingers a little longer when tucking her in at night. How her father stands in the backyard at dusk, just looking at the sky. The word détente enters the vocabulary. It's French for relaxation of tension, and through the late 1960s and 1970s, it becomes the framework for a slightly gentler version of the Cold War. The superpowers still don't trust each other, but they start to talk. Arms control treaties are signed. Cultural exchanges happen. American and Soviet scientists collaborate. There's even a joint space mission, Apollo-Soyuz, where astronauts shake hands in orbit, speaking in each other's languages, laughing at the strangeness of it all. A teenager in California watches the Apollo-Soyuz docking on television. His parents are civil rights activists, veterans of protest marches and sit-ins. They've raised him to question authority, to see through propaganda. But even they pause at this image. American and Soviet spacecraft locked together, men from enemy nations sharing food and stories 140 miles above the Earth. Maybe, his mother says softly, maybe it doesn't have to be this way forever. The teenager wants to believe that. He's tired of duck-and-cover drills, tired of news reports about wars in countries whose names he struggles to pronounce. He wants to believe that the world can change, that the long shadow might finally be lifting. But détente is fragile. Even as diplomats smile for cameras, the arms race continues. Both sides develop missiles with multiple warheads, each one capable of hitting a different target. They build nuclear submarines that glide silent and invisible beneath the oceans. The arsenals grow large enough to destroy the world several times over, as if once wouldn't be sufficient. It's madness, this logic. Mutually assured destruction, they call it, with an acronym that fits. MAD. We won't attack you because you'll destroy us in response, and you won't attack us for the same reason. So we're all safe as long as we're all capable of total annihilation. It's the geopolitical equivalent of 2 people holding guns to each other's heads forever, fingers on triggers, never blinking, calling it peace. And yet people live their lives. They have to. A woman in Moscow goes to work at the textile factory, rides the crowded metro home, stops at the market for bread and butter. Her daughter is getting married next month. There are preparations to make, a dress to alter, relatives to coordinate. The threat of nuclear war is always there, background radiation you can't see or feel. But today she's thinking about whether there will be enough chairs for everyone at the reception. In East Germany, the Berlin Wall stands as the Cold War's most visible symbol, concrete and barbed wire splitting a city in half. Families divided, lovers separated, people who can see each other across the barrier but can't touch. Some try to escape, tunneling under, flying over in homemade hot air balloons, crashing cars through checkpoints. Some succeed, many don't. Picture a woman on the eastern side, standing in her apartment with the windows open. It's summer, 1976. Through the gap in the buildings, she can just see a corner of West Berlin, bright with neon signs. Sometimes, at night, she hears music drifting over the wall, Western rock and roll, brash and free. Her son asks her why they can't go there to the other side. She doesn't know how to explain it in a way that makes sense to a 7-year-old. She barely understands it herself. It's complicated, she tells him. Grown-up things. He accepts this for now. Children always do. But she knows he'll ask again, and eventually, it's complicated, won't be enough. The 1970s drift into the 1980s, and détente begins to fray. The Soviets invade Afghanistan. The Americans elect Ronald Reagan, who calls the Soviet Union an evil empire and jokes on a hot mic about bombing Russia. The rhetoric hardens again. The bulletin of atomic scientists moves the doomsday clock closer to midnight. But something else is happening too, something quieter. The Soviet Union in the 1980s is showing its age. The economy staggers under the weight of military spending. Factories produce goods nobody wants. Grocery store shelves go empty. Apartments are cramped, often shared by multiple families. The idealism of the early years has curdled into cynicism. People wait in line for hours to buy bread, and when someone tells a joke about the party leadership, everyone laughs but glances over their shoulders first. A young man in Minsk works as an engineer. He's good at his job, good with numbers and systems, but he's also frustrated. The technology they use is years behind the West. The bureaucracy strangles innovation. You need permission for everything, and permission takes months, and by the time you get it, the moment has passed. He listens to Voice of America on a shortwave radio late at night, volume low, curtains drawn. The Western broadcasts are technically illegal, but lots of people listen. They talk about a world he's never seen: consumer abundance, political freedom, rock concerts, blue jeans, choices. He doesn't believe all of it. Propaganda works in both directions. But he wonders. In 1985, a man named Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the Soviet leader. He's younger than his predecessors, more dynamic. He introduces policies with names that become famous: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. The idea is to reform the system, to let in some fresh air without dismantling the whole structure. But once you crack open a door, it's hard to control how wide it swings. Newspapers start publishing stories that would have been unthinkable a few years earlier. Articles questioning policy, exposing corruption, discussing Stalin's crimes openly. People begin to speak more freely, testing the boundaries of this new openness. In coffee shops and university hallways, debates erupt. What kind of society do we want? What did we sacrifice all these years for? In East Germany, people watch West German television, which they can pick up despite attempts to jam the signal. They see the prosperity, the freedom, the color, and vitality. The contrast becomes harder to ignore. Picture a family in Leipzig, gathered around their television on a Thursday night. The father has a good job in a chemical plant. The mother teaches school. Their son is 17, restless, with the particular impatience of teenagers everywhere. On screen, West German youth are dancing at a concert, hair wild, clothes bright, faces ecstatic with joy and music. "Why can't we have that?" the boy asks. His parents exchange a look. They've learned to be careful, even in their own home. Walls have ears, as the saying goes. But lately, the fear has started to feel less sharp. Something is shifting. "Maybe someday," the mother says. Things are changing. She doesn't know how right she is. The year is 1989, and history moves fast. In Poland, the Solidarity movement, a labor union turned political force, wins elections, forming the first non-communist government in the Eastern Bloc. In Hungary, the government opens its border with Austria. East Germans start making their way there, then crossing into the West. It's a trickle at first, then a flood. Every Monday night in Leipzig, people gather at the Nikolaikirche, St. Nicholas Church. It starts as a prayer service, but it becomes something more, a peaceful demonstration. Thousands, then tens of thousands, then 100,000 people marching through the streets with candles chanting, "Wir sind das Volk," we are the people. The regime doesn't know how to respond. Tanks could disperse them, but at what cost? The world is watching. The Soviet Union, dealing with its own problems, makes it clear they won't send troops to prop up East Germany's government. The old playbook doesn't work anymore. On November 9th, 1989, a bureaucrat at a press conference makes a mistake. He announces that East Germans can travel to the West, effective immediately. It's not supposed to work that way. There should be regulations, paperwork, a gradual process. But people hear immediately, and they move. They go to the checkpoints at the Berlin Wall, thousands of them, more arriving every minute. The guards don't know what to do. They haven't received orders. The crowd presses forward, not violent, but insistent, inevitable as tide, and then someone opens a gate. People pour through. They're crying and laughing at once, embracing strangers, champagne bottles passed hand to hand. Some climb onto the wall itself, that gray concrete scar that's divided the city for 28 years. They dance on it. They hit it with hammers and chisels, taking chunks as souvenirs, as proof that it's really happening. Imagine a couple in their 50s, standing at the place where the wall once kept them apart. They were childhood sweethearts. separated when the barrier went up. She stayed in the east, he fled to the west. They've lived parallel lives for decades, each marrying other people, having children, building existence around the absence of each other. Now they stand 3 feet apart, neither quite believing it's real. They've aged, of course. He's gained weight. His hair has gone gray. She wears glasses now, lines etched around her mouth, but their eyes are the same. "Hello," he says, voice cracking. "Hello," she manages. They don't embrace. They're different people now, with different lives, but they stand there together, watching the celebrations swirl around them, mourning and celebrating at once, mourning what they lost, celebrating that no one else will have to lose it the same way. The wall falls, not just in Berlin, but across Eastern Europe. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution happened so fast and peacefully it feels like a miracle. Romania's is violent and quick. The Soviet Union itself begins to fracture. The Baltic states declare independence. The old order crumbles like sandcastles at high tide. And then, in December 1991, the Soviet Union simply ceases to exist. 74 years of communist rule end not with a war, but with a signature on paper. The red flag comes down from the Kremlin. The Cold War is over. When the Cold War ends, it doesn't feel like victory to everyone. In Russia, the 1990s bring chaos, hyperinflation, organized crime, a sense that everything solid has dissolved. People who'd spent their whole lives in the Soviet system suddenly find themselves in a different world, and not all of them thrive there. An elderly woman in St. Petersburg stands in line at a market. She's a retired teacher, her pension now worthless, buying bread with money that will be worth half as much tomorrow. She remembers the old days, the shortages, yes, but also the certainty. You knew where you stood. Everyone was equal in scarcity. Now there are billionaires and beggars, and the gap between them yawns like an abyss. "Was it better before?" her granddaughter asks her. The old woman sighs. "It was different," she says. "Not better, not worse, just what we knew." In America, there's relief, triumph. The evil empire has fallen. Democracy prevailed. Francis Fukuyama writes about the end of history, suggesting that liberal democracy has won so decisively that the great ideological struggles are over. It's an optimistic idea, comforting in its way. But history doesn't end. It just changes shape. For the generation that grew up during the Cold War, the ending leaves them unmoored in subtle ways. Fear had been a constant companion for so long that its absence feels strange. A man in his 50s who'd spent his career in defense contracting finds himself at a party trying to explain to younger people what it was like. "You just lived with it," he says. "The knowledge that it could all end any day. You didn't think about it constantly, but it was always there, underneath everything." The young people nod politely, but he can see they don't really get it. How could they? They grew up in a different world. His daughter, 23, asks him, "Were you scared all the time?" He thinks about it. "Not scared exactly," he says slowly. "More like aware, the way you're aware of your heartbeat if you stop and pay attention. Most of the time you don't notice, but it's always there, keeping you alive or about to stop." The Cold War's children carry its marks. Some become peace activists, determined that such a standoff should never happen again. Others become cynics, trusting no government, no ideology. Still others throw themselves into building the new world, the internet age, the global economy, the interconnected future where maybe borders and walls matter less. In East Germany, a woman goes through her late mother's apartment, sorting through belongings. She finds a box of letters, hidden at the back of a closet. They're letters her mother wrote, but never sent, addressed to her sister in West Germany. Decades of life recorded in careful handwriting, the births of children, the death of her husband, small joys and large sorrows. The sister died in 1987, 2 years before the wall fell. The daughter sits on the floor surrounded by these phantom letters, these messages sent into silence. She cries for what was lost, for the time they could have had and didn't. The Cold War didn't kill her mother's sister, didn't put her in a grave, but it killed the relationship as surely as any bullet. How many conversations never happened? How many friendships never formed? How many possibilities died before they could be born? Strangled by suspicion and ideology and fear. Drive through the American Southwest and you'll pass abandoned missile silos, concrete scars on the landscape. Some have been converted, turned into data centers or museums or, bizarrely, luxury homes. Others just sit empty, slowly being reclaimed by weather and time. They're monuments to a peculiar kind of madness, billions of dollars spent on weapons designed never to be used. A photographer specializing in Cold War ruins explores one such silo. He descends metal stairs into darkness, flashlight beam cutting through dust motes. The control room still has its original panels, buttons, and switches for systems long defunct. There's graffiti on the walls now, teenagers' names and crude drawings. The juxtaposition strikes him. This place once held the power to end civilizations, and now it's a spot for local kids to drink beer and make out. He takes photographs, trying to capture something about the absurdity and tragedy of it all. But he's not sure he succeeds. How do you photograph an absence? How do you show what it felt like to build these things, to staff them, to wake up every day knowing your job was to wait for an order you hoped would never come? In Russia, there are similar ruins, radar installations pointed west, submarine bases on frozen coasts, closed cities where nuclear weapons were designed and built, places so secret they didn't appear on maps. Some have been cleaned up. Others remain toxic, radioactive, dangerous. The Cold War's environmental legacy will outlast everyone who lived through it. But the legacy isn't just physical. It's psychological, cultural, woven into how we think about security and threat, about enemies and allies. A woman who grew up in the 1960s becomes a therapist. She notices patterns in her clients, especially those of her generation. A particular kind of anxiety, a difficulty with trust, a tendency to catastrophize that goes beyond normal worry. It's as if growing up with the possibility of annihilation baked something into them at a neurological level. She writes a paper about it, calls it generational trauma. The idea isn't new, but applying it to Cold War children is. The paper causes a small stir in her field. Some colleagues disagree. Weren't the Cold War kids fine? Didn't they go on to live normal lives? To thrive even? Yes, she argues, and that's remarkable. Resilience is real, powerful, but so is the scar tissue. In schools, the Cold War becomes history. Teachers explain it to students who've never known anything but the post-Cold War world. They show films of the wall falling, of missile crises, of duck and cover drills. The students find it hard to imagine. Nuclear war seems like something from science fiction, not a lived reality. Did you really think you were going to die? A high school student asks her teacher, who's old enough to remember the 1980s. Sometimes, the teacher says honestly. Yeah, sometimes I did. But you still went to school, did homework, all that? What else were we going to do? The student thinks about this. He's grown up with different fears. Terrorism, climate change, school shootings. He wonders if every generation gets its own version of the unthinkable, its own shadow to live under. In Chapter 11, we'll see how the Cold War's lessons still echo. The Cold War officially ended in 1991, but its structures and habits persist. NATO still exists, expanded now to include former Soviet republics. Russia, diminished but still nuclear-armed, still vast, struggles to define itself in the new order. Old rivalries flare in new conflicts, in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Syria. The ideological battle may be over, but geopolitics remains a chess game played with human pieces. A young diplomat, born in 1992, works at the State Department. She's fluent in Russian, fascinated by the region. She didn't live through the Cold War, but she's inherited its consequences. The people she negotiates with, the Russian officials and diplomats, many of them did live through it. She can see it in how they think, the assumptions they make about American intentions, the reflexive defensiveness that surfaces in meetings. After a particularly frustrating negotiation session, she has dinner with her mentor, a veteran diplomat in his 70s. "Why is it still like this?" she asks. "The Cold War ended before I was born. Why can't we just move past it?" He swirls his wine, considering. "Because nations have long memories," he says, "and because some of the same people are still in power, or their protégés are. They learned how the world works in a certain context, and that learning goes deep." He pauses. "Also, because we never really reconciled. There was no peace treaty, no truth commission, no collective agreement on what it all meant. It just ended. And then everyone moved on without processing it." She thinks about this often in the months that follow. How do societies heal from decades of institutionalized fear? How do you build trust after 2 generations of systematic mistrust? In popular culture, the Cold War becomes aesthetic, a setting for spy thrillers and period dramas, all gray suits and cigarette smoke, tense meetings in shadowy rooms. It's been smoothed and simplified, made into entertainment. The real texture of it, the grinding, daily anxiety, the moral compromises, the ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, that's harder to capture. A novelist who grew up in Cold War Czechoslovakia tries to write about it. She finds herself stuck, unable to convey what it felt like. How do you explain to someone who's never experienced it what it means to weigh every word before you speak it, to see neighbors disappear and learn not to ask questions, to love your country and fear your government at the same time? She writes and deletes, writes and deletes. Finally, she settles on telling a small story, a single family, a single year, not trying to capture everything, just one fragment of the larger truth. It's the best she can do. Around the world, Cold War children are aging now, moving into their 60s, 70s, 80s. They're becoming the elders, the ones who remember. Their grandchildren ask them questions sometimes, curious about this black and white era before the internet, before smartphones. When the world seemed simpler, it wasn't, and more dangerous, it was. A grandfather in Wisconsin shows his grandson his old dog tags from Vietnam. He'd been drafted, spent a year in the jungle fighting a war that was really about ideology, about containing communism, about dominoes that supposedly would fall if Vietnam went red. "Did you ever shoot anyone?" the boy asks, 12 years old and morbidly curious the way 12-year-olds are. "Yes," the grandfather says quietly. He doesn't elaborate. Some things you don't pass on. "Was it scary? Every day? Were they bad guys?" The grandfather is quiet for a long moment. "They were soldiers like me," he says finally. "Young men who'd been told to fight. Some of them probably thought we were the bad guys." The boy absorbs this, his worldview complicating slightly. Good and evil aren't as clear as movies make them seem. In Russia, a grandmother tells her granddaughter about the day the Soviet Union fell. "I cried," she says. "Even though things were difficult, even though we struggled, it was still my country. I'd grown up believing we were building something important, something that would last forever, and then it just wasn't there anymore." "Do you miss it?" the girl asks. "I miss being young," the grandmother says, which is and isn't an answer. The Cold War generation carries these paradoxes. They're relieved it ended, but nostalgic for the certainty of their youth. They understand it was dangerous and necessary to escape, but also mourn what was lost. They want their children and grandchildren to understand, but also hope they never have to. In archives and attics, letters and diaries wait to be discovered, primary sources for historians yet unborn, who will write dissertations and books trying to understand this strange, tense peace, this war that never quite was and never quite wasn't. And in Chapter 12, we'll bring the story home. It's evening now, and we're almost at the end of our journey. Let's sit together a moment longer and think about what it means that millions of people lived their entire lives in the shadow of potential annihilation, and yet chose to love anyway, to build anyway, to hope anyway, because they did. They fell in love at bus stops and coffee shops. They had children, deliberately brought new life into an uncertain world because the alternative was to let fear win. They planted gardens that wouldn't mature for years. They wrote books and composed symphonies and painted murals on city walls. They invented things, started businesses, taught school, healed the sick, made each other laugh. Life insisted on itself. It always does. A couple in their 70s sits on their porch as the sun sets. They've been married 48 years since 1977. They met at a protest against nuclear weapons, both of them college students convinced they could change the world. "We didn't end it," the wife says, rocking gently in her chair. "The Cold War, all those marches and petitions, and it ended for reasons that had nothing to do with us." "Maybe," her husband says, "or maybe it all added up. All those small refusals to accept it as normal, all those people saying, 'not in our name.' Maybe that mattered." "Maybe," she echoes, unconvinced, but willing to believe. They watch their grandson playing in the yard, chasing fireflies in the gathering dusk. He's 8, obsessed with dinosaurs and video games, utterly unconcerned with nuclear weapons or ideological struggles. They didn't tell him about the drills they did in school, about the nightmares they had, about the March Day in 1983 when Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, and they were sure it meant war. He'll learn about the Cold War in school eventually. It will be history to him. Like World War II was history to them, important, but not visceral, not the air he breathes. Is that progress? They think it might be. The greatest gift you can give the next generation is a slightly less terrifying world than you inherited. Around the globe, in different languages and time zones, other people who lived through the Cold War are having similar thoughts, remembering, grieving what was lost, grateful for what was preserved. They remember the fear, yes, but they also remember the first time they heard glasnost and thought maybe, just maybe, things could change. They remember the Berlin Wall coming down and staying up all night, watching it on television, crying with joy for people they'd never met. They remember the moment they realized their children wouldn't grow up with the same nightmares. The Cold War didn't end perfectly. It left problems unsolved, wounds unhealed, weapons still capable of ending civilization. But it ended, which once seemed impossible. The long twilight gave way to dawn, and even if the day hasn't turned out quite as hoped, at least it's day. A teacher in Berlin takes her students to the remains of the wall, now preserved as a memorial and gallery. Street artists have covered it with murals, messages of peace and unity, stylized doves, kissing Soviet and American soldiers, the phrase, "Make love not walls," in 20 languages. One student runs her fingers along the concrete, rough and cool under her hand. "It's hard to imagine," she says, "that this divided the city, that people couldn't just cross over." "That's good," the teacher says, "that you find it hard to imagine. May you never stop finding it unimaginable. The Cold War is over, but its lessons remain, about what fear does to societies, about how easily we divide into us and them, about the importance of talking to our enemies, of maintaining the fragile connections that prevent misunderstanding from escalating into catastrophe, about resilience and hope, and the stubborn persistence of human goodness, even in dark times. The people who lived through it are witnesses now, carriers of memory, and as they age, as they pass on, the responsibility shifts, to remember for them, to learn from what they endured, to build a world where children don't have to practice hiding under desks, where families aren't split by walls, where annihilation isn't always lurking at the edge of consciousness. It's a worthy goal, worth working toward, even if we never quite reach it, just like they did. The Cold War generations who planted trees they'd never see full grown, who believed in tomorrow even when tomorrow wasn't guaranteed. And now, in our epilogue, we'll bring it all together, one last time. So we've walked together through 44 years of history, from the rubble of 1945 to the falling wall of 1989, from Sputnik's beep to the red flag coming down from the Kremlin. We've met the people who lived it, mothers hanging laundry, fathers digging shelters, children crouching under desks, teenagers scanning the sky for satellites, lovers separated by concrete and ideology, diplomats sweating through tense negotiations, soldiers fighting in proxy wars, protesters marching with candles, ordinary people trying to live ordinary lives in extraordinary times. What does it mean to grow up when the world might end at any moment? And yet somehow, life still asks you to go to school, fall in love, dream about the future. Maybe it means learning that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to build and love and hope despite it. Maybe it means understanding that the small human moments, the birthday parties, the conversations over coffee, the hands held in darkness, are acts of defiance against forces that would reduce us to pawns in someone else's game. The Cold War shaped generations, yes. It left marks on hearts and minds, created reflexes and anxieties that persist. But it also revealed something beautiful, that people will choose life over and over, even when death shadows them. That given a chance, given an opening, given the smallest crack in the wall, they'll reach toward each other. That hope is stubborn, and love is defiant, and the human spirit keeps insisting on tomorrow. The people who lived through those decades are heroes in the quietest sense. Not for great acts of valor, but for the daily decision to keep going, to not give in to despair, to pass on to their children a world that, while not perfect, was still worth inheriting. Their story is over now, that particular chapter closed. But the lessons remain, waiting for us to learn them, to carry them forward into whatever challenges our own era brings. Who would you like to explore next? What other journey through history shall we take together, learning what we can from those who came before? For now, though, rest. The Cold War is over. The long shadow has lifted. The world turns on, carrying all those who endured, all those who hoped, all those who refused to let fear have the final word. Sleep well, and good night.